Hello everybody, I am Tom and you are watching my review/critique of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Before we get started, I'll point out that this video will have spoilers when it comes to background footage as well as my description of some of the more in-depth story stuff. As such, if you just wanted to see if you should pick this game up, or if you want to avoid spoilers, I'll just summarize it now. I love this game. It was made by From Software, and that carries with it all that would entail. To put it briefly, if you enjoyed any of the Souls games and or Bloodborne, you'll likely also enjoy Sekiro, with the caveat that there's no online play, either PvP or co-op, and that character customization is kinda limited comparatively to the older games. You only ever have a katana as your main weapon, for instance, so there's that. But if neither of those facts put you off, then Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, easy pick up for fans of the previous previous From Software games. For those unfamiliar with From's previous games, Sekiro is a third-person action game with a heavy emphasis on sword combat. It does have some kind of stealth elements as well, however I wouldn't exactly call it a stealth game per se. But without spoilers, you're essentially a ninja with a grappling hook, so if that sounds cool, it may be worth picking up. Now from this point on, the video will contain spoilers, so if you've already played it, or you don't care about spoilers, you can happily go on from this point. Thank you very much. As stated just before, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, from here on out I'll simply call it Sekiro for brevity, is a third-person action game based on a fantasy version of the Sengoku period of Japan, which is from like the mid-15th to 17th century. Sekiro has you take on the role of the shinobi simply named Wolf, as he travels around the Daimyo of Ashina in search of Kuro, the child he's been charged with protecting, and at the time of the game, there's both inside and outside forces attacking Ashina, and Kuro is important to the group that's attempting a kind of soft coup, and hence he's been kidnapped. The combat is very much based around alternating strikes and deflecting, think parrying in Dark Souls if you've played that, but much faster. And many of the areas can be stealthed around, either avoiding or stealth killing the smaller enemies to make your job easier when you take on the many mini-bosses that are throughout Sekiro. But to explain more on that, I'll go into the actual gameplay. As I just said, Sekiro relies heavily on its deflection mechanic to carry its combat forward, and the combat is reliant on a sort of flow of strikes back and forth, and once you have the rhythm for a particular enemy type down, it becomes incredibly satisfying to fight them. Rather than taking your enemies down to 0 health, although for most, if not all of the enemies, this method will work as well, you can just take them down to 0 health, but the game has what's called a posture system. Essentially, the more that a character takes hits that are not perfectly deflected, so if you either get hit and don't deflect at all, or you block rather than deflecting, your posture meter will be raised. After the meter's broken, the enemy, or Wolf himself as it works for both you and the enemy, will be open to a finisher move that will instantly kill them. Some enemies, notably bosses and mini-bosses, will require 2 or 3 death blows to kill, making those fights essentially multi-phase for every single one of them. Stealth is also a fairly useful and rather unique feature when it comes to From Software games. Being a ninja, the range of movement that you're afforded in Sekiro is hugely expanded from either Dark Souls or Bloodborne. Sekiro has an emphasis on verticality that makes it really fun movement options when you're going around each area. This is facilitated by the fact that Wolf has a grappling hook that he can use to launch himself to certain grapple points throughout the areas of the game, so it means that verticality is a much bigger part of the game. This, coupled with drop-down assassinations and stealth kills, gives a variety of options from getting from point A to point B in a particular area. One could simply go gung-ho in with a sword, just swinging wildly, or you can take the stealthier approach and go around enemies, or you can do any combination thereof. Some notable differences with Sekiro from previous FromSoft games that are certainly worth noting is that for starters, there's no multiplayer in Sekiro at all. There's no PvP and there's no co-op. This is somewhat irrelevant to me, as I always preferred the sort of single-player aspect of all these games, and I just thought PvP was kind of a nice bonus rather than a key aspect. However, I'm distinctly aware that there are some players, those weirdos who like Dark Souls 2 the best for some reason. I'm joking, you guys are awesome as well. But those players love PvP, and that's kind of the main game for them. The rest of the game is just building up your build to do PvP. And as such, Sekiro doesn't have any of that, so if you're playing the games for PvP, you're not going to find much here for Sekiro. Somewhat attached to that is that there's less variety of customization in Sekiro than previous From Software games. I said this earlier, but for instance, Wolf only has a katana is the only weapon he uses. Disregarding shinobi tools for now, I'll get to them in a minute. But there's also no armor system whatsoever, so he simply has the same ninja armor for the entirety of the game. And this could potentially hurt replayability for some players. It's worth noting, however, that there's incredibly tight combat in Sekiro, and it's only really possible because of the limited access to weapons, as it allows them to focus on how the katana feels in battle specifically, which increases the predictability of how each fight is going to go, allowing for a faster and tighter swordsmanship. Moving on to the upgrading system in Sekiro, it's based around 4 main aspects. Defeating mini-bosses will award the player with prayer beads, 4 of which together will net you a health upgrade, similar to like Zelda heart pieces going to a heart container. And as for increasing your offensive capabilities, whenever you defeat a boss, as in a named boss as opposed to the many mini-bosses in the game, you'll be awarded a memory, which can be used to increase your attack power instead. These two are the kind of most basic upgrading in the game. They're essentially just straight stat increases for defense and offense respectively. The next 2 upgrading systems are more about diversity of play rather than pure power, and they come in the form of skills and shinobi tools. Skills, as the name might suggest, are just upgrades for the Wolf's Arsenal. These come from a few different trees, and they range from passive abilities such as increasing your stealthiness, to more active abilities like countering thrusts. Makira Counter is awesome. If you're playing this game, get Makira Counter, it's absolutely amazing. It makes the game way more fun. And they go all the way up to like combat arts that allow for like specialized attacks, such as like 360-degree sweeps or sword combos. And the currency for earning these skill points is actually experience, like you would get in a classical RPG, where you kill enemies or bosses and that gives you XP. And after you get enough XP to go to the next level up, you will get a skill point. The caveat being there, if you die, you lose half of the XP towards your next level, so your next skill point, as well as half your money, and there's no way of getting that back. There is a small mechanic in there where there's a thing called Unseen Aid, and what Unseen Aid will do is essentially it's like you're blessed by Buddha, and then you don't lose any of your XP and you don't lose any of your money. So that just happens at a random chance. It's like, I think at base 30%, and based on a few other mechanics will lower or increase depending on what you do. Shinobi tools are the final upgrading kind of mechanic, and they're essentially various equipment that you can put into your shinobi prosthetic, which I haven't really spoken about yet, but you have literally a 16th century prosthetic arm, which is just awesome. Like, it's so cool. It's made of like bone and rope and stuff. It's very, very cool. But the tools that you add range from simple things like a shuriken launcher, all the way up to like complex, to the point of lunacy complex things like the loaded umbrella, which is literally an umbrella made out of iron that'll like block projectiles and most sword attacks. And you like hold it over your head. All of these tools are obtainable by finding them in the world and then bringing them back to the sculptor, who is an old shinobi you meet near the start of the game, and he's one of like the constant characters that you'll see throughout your journey. You can also go back to him when you have relevant crafting materials, and he will upgrade each of the 10 different shinobi tools multiple times up like a tiered upgrade tree. Now all of these upgrades, the shinobi tools, the skills, as well as increasing your attack power, increasing your health, they're not needed. They certainly make the game easier and more entertaining in the case of skills and shinobi tools, but none of them are really required to do any of the content in Sekiro. I bring this up for a very specific point, and it's a kind of quick digression I want to make into stuff that was happening near the launch of Sekiro, and that's the difficulty of Sekiro. There was a fair amount of hubbub going around, and a lot of games journalists were talking about difficulty around the time of the launch of Sekiro, which they also did around Dark Souls and Bloodborne. It happens pretty much every time From Software releases a game. But it's regarding the difficulty of it and whether or not there should be an easy mode. I feel like this argument comes from people who don't really get the kind of game that From Software is trying to do here. The difficulty of the game is specifically designed to be like baked into the game. To die is an expectation, so much so that all of From's games, dying is an integral part of the lore of the game. It's in the story. This is done, in my opinion, because one of the best parts about these games is learning the mechanical mastery of a particular fight or encounter, and dying over and over as a process of elimination is literally part of, like, the game's design. It's expected, and it's appreciated by, I think, the majority of the game's fans. I also can't help but feel that games journalism these days has turned rather vapid, and I get the feeling that this complaint comes out because a hard game, quote-unquote, is too difficult to complete before a deadline on releasing a review for most publications. Which, although I sympathise with that, I don't think a game designer should change their game design simply to make a journalist's job easier. However, this is a digression. I don't really want to divulge into a rant, so let's just move on to the story of Sekiro. As I said earlier, Sekiro is based around a fantasy version of 16th century Japan, where the country was separated into many warring factions and daimyo, or feudal lords. Sekiro takes place in the land of Ashina, which is the namesake of the great general Isshin Ashina, who wrested control of the land and killed the previous feudal lord named General Tamura. The player controls the shinobi known as Wolf, later dubbed Sekiro by Isshin himself, as he fights to both regain his memory and to protect his charge, the young divine heir named Kuro. Kuro's blood is special in that it can grant immortality, kind of a big thing, which he does actually give to Wolf in order to save his life. And as such, he's kind of much sought after, most notably by Isshin's grandson Genichiro, who, wanting to renew Ashina and also protect the borders from foreign powers, has taken advantage of his grandfather's old age and kind of ailed body, and he's trying to stage a coup, although at the start, it's kind of like a soft coup for the most part. The first stage of his coup is to kidnap Kuro and use his blood to aid Ashina. Immortal soldiers would be very useful, after all, it does kind of make sense. Kuro, however, is reticent to use his power, as whenever an immortal dies and is resurrected, a sickness known only as dragon rot begins to spread throughout the land, and although Kuro wants to help his people and his land, he's also too aware that doing so could cause much more harm than good. I won't go much more into the depth of the story as it is, but it is a very, very good story. I like it a lot. It's fairly simple, but it's very well told. I played the entire game with the Japanese dub, as that's just what it was default, and the voice acting was stellar. Kuro particularly had multiple lines there that really portrayed his conflicting emotions, where he was feeling about his role in the war and how his inaction caused problems and there were so many people dying, and also the consequences of what his actions had, notably by granting Wolf immortality. And he seems to look up to Wolf as like a parent or a sibling figure almost. But he's really sad by the fact that he's subjecting this person who he clearly loves to endless deaths over and over and over for his own sake, essentially. And the voice actings for those parts were really, really good, and they were just so well done. The narrative structure is far more straightforward and expository than From Software's previous titles, which I'm sure many fans will actually really enjoy. A lot of people didn't like how nebulous Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Demon Souls were in their storytelling, but I actually really liked it. Having said that, there is still a lot of stuff here for people like myself who really enjoy that kind of nebulous contextual storytelling that From's become known for. It's just more about the background lore and the things that are happening politically above the level that is kind of base, where you're helping Kuro. That storyline is told very clearly, and structurally, it's like a very structured narrative, whereas all of the other stuff is still nebulous and you've got to look around to find it, and you've got to see, well, they've got these enemies here, that means this, and then later on these enemies get killed by these other enemies. And it's kind of, there's a lot of that stuff that you can get a lot of knowledge about the world through that way, but the actual story itself is far more straightforward. And talking about straightforward story, we can now move on to the presentation and actual performance of Sekiro. Sekiro ran surprisingly well on my machine, which is certainly on the older side of average at this point, running with most settings on high to medium, and it was just a constant 60 frames a second. Worth noting that was at 1080p. However, I only dropped like a few frames in a few places where there was a huge amount of particles floating around. Aside from that, it was pretty much consistent 60 and really, really good. The only problem with performance I really had is that on the 50 odd hours or so that my first playthrough was, maybe even more, I had 2 occasions that I can remember where I crashed to desktop. There was no warning or error message or anything, it was just straight to desktop. Although that problem was so rare and inconsistent, I'd kind of even be sure that it was the game being screwy and not just me recording or something happening in a background process. I don't really know, but it was very rare, but it was very strange when it happened. As for the presentation of Sekiro, it's simply stunning. There's a variety of distinct areas, all of which have like a unique feeling to them, but at the same time, when running from one area to the next, it's never particularly jarring due to the fantastic way that the world is ordered and partitioned. The character models, likewise, incredibly accurate and really, really good, fitting that nice middle of looking realistic without falling into that kind of uncanny valley territory. The music of Sekiro, also absolutely fantastic in my opinion, subdued when it needed to be, and appropriately uplifting or cool when the situation required. It also worked really well as like an intuitive indicator of when stealth was broken, which is something that was so instinctive that I didn't even really notice it while I was playing. It wasn't until I was writing this review that I thought about it and I was like, yeah, actually that was really good. But, to the conclusion. In closing, I loved Sekiro. While its combat is somewhat restrictive compared with Dark Souls or Bloodborne due to the lack of diversity in weaponry and armor, the converse of that is that the homogeny of enemy encounters allows for a combat system that's smoother and more fun than anything else in From Software's repertoire to date, and indeed I'd argue more than probably most third-person action games. In fact, I think I would probably make the argument it is the best combat in any third-person action game I've ever played. The story, although simple, is presented in a brilliant way with outstanding voice acting, at least in the native Japanese. I can't speak to the others, I didn't listen to them, and is presented in a fantastic world filled with diverse and exceptional looking environments and characters. To wrap things up, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is an excellent game. If you're a fan of From Software's previous titles, I would recommend Sekiro without hesitation, the only exception being for those who played the older games purely for the PvP, as there isn't any of that here. As for people who are completely new to the genre of sort of From Software games, I would say that it's a definite purchase for anyone who enjoys third-person action games, as this is just a standout of the genre. However, that's going to be it. So if you like the video, please leave a like. If you aren't subscribed already, please consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time. Hey everybody, I don't usually talk within the end of these end screens, however I'm going to today because I just want to point out to anyone that I've done a full blind playthrough of Sekiro, so if anyone's interested in watching that, the link for it is right here on the end screen, as well as linked in the description below. Thanks for watching, see you guys.